kind of expect a few weeks to where we're going to...
Who's a professor of dermatology at Emory University School of Medicine in Atlanta. And you can hear some of the little jokes we were having up front here about the weather and all, but that may account for some of our tardy colleagues here this morning. But in talking about some other topics that Dr. Swirlick wanted to present to the group, one that I thought would be quite a challenge, and he's willing to accept that, and I think probably we're going to hear some very interesting observations that give us a bit of a pause to contemplate what is not only being proposed in dermatology, but actually a number of other medical specialties, and that is cancer screening, in fact, disease screening in general. And this morning he's going to give a presentation aptly titled The Melanoma Epidemic More Apparent Than Real, Uncertainties in Melanoma Screening. So Bob, thank you for coming in and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's see. Queued up. It's not working. Oh, there we go. I believe the carousel needs to be moved all the way to the beginning.
Is there something on
No, I had run through the slides, and I don't think I set it back to slide one. Yeah.
it needs to be
I think I ran it through and then to make sure that they weren't in backwards. Okay, thank you. The usual response when I present this topic is one of rather astonishment that how could one ever think that melanoma epidemic is not real. There are people dying of it. There are lots of people diagnosed with it. But there are certain inconsistencies which I think we need to address, particularly given the mandate from the Academy that to more aggressively screen patients for melanoma and make the public more aware of the diagnosis and the disease. And there's certain basic assumptions that all these decisions were based upon. First is that the incidence of melanoma is increasing. And that the second is early diagnosis will save lives, and aggressive screening of the general public will result in early detection of clinically relevant lesions. And I think that's the key words, clinically relevant. And the last point was that the facts are so clear that no additional study is really needed prior to institution of widespread screening. Are these assumptions correct? Well, the first assumption is that the incidence of melanoma is increasing. And is that actually true? If you look at the statistics that have been put forth for the U.S., the apparent incidence of melanoma has really more than doubled over the past 20 years. And the increase in mortality has increased at a lesser pace. And the increased mortality has been essentially confined to very specific subgroups, that is, older men over the age of 65. It is assumed that we are in the midst of an epidemic, but due to early detection, mortality has not increased substantially. But is this the most likely explanation? This is a figure that I generated from another figure that was published by an American Cancer Society monograph that was edited and written by Tony Hood. And the upper bars, the upper line is the incidence of melanoma diagnosed in this country from 1950 to 1990, and the lower line is the mortality. Some of these numbers prior to 1970 may be somewhat suspect because the data collection is less than ideal. And when I looked at this particular graph, something struck me, and that is, if this incidence is true, if the increase in incidence is true, the ability to identify those at risk must have been unbelievably good, because generally in the population, if an epidemic hits, there are two populations, one that we get to and one that we don't get to. And the one that we don't get to, you would expect that the melanoma should progress and cause an increase in mortality and thick lesions. Is that likely? Well, there have been some studies, surveys of populations, and it's found, interestingly enough, that 75% of melanoma is self-discovered. And when I say self-discovered, I mean either about half of the lesions are self-discovered and another quarter of the lesions are discovered by a spouse or family member. Well, what percentage of people examine themselves? Those numbers really aren't known in this country, but in Australia, which has 20 years of melanoma education behind it, perhaps up to 50% of people admit that they examine themselves. But intriguingly, only a third of those who find suspicious lesions ever come to the doctor. Well, that really equates to only about 15 to 20% of the population. And in the U.S., it's likely that these numbers are much, much smaller because the population is clearly not as aware of melanoma. So the melanoma paradox is, if 75% of the melanoma is self-discovered and 80% of the population is not looking, why do we not see an increase in thick lesions in those who are not looking? Are those at risk of the diagnosis only those who are looking? Well, in order to really address this question, the American data is not sufficient. The best data collection that's occurred has been in Australia. And Australia has the highest incidence of melanoma in the world. Rates in Queensland are up to 5 times higher than what's seen in U.S. whites, 60 per 100,000. Mortality is extremely low. And intriguingly, most of the lesions are thin lesions. And any increase in mortality is exclusively seen in older men. 2 papers recently published by Burton and Armstrong, one in Melanoma Research in 1994 and one in the International Journal in 1993, bring up this same uncertainty regarding the increase in incidence in contrast to the lack of increase in melanoma. And the data from these papers show an interesting observation. They observed a population, a relatively closed population of about 500,000 people in New South Wales. And virtually all of the skin care and derm path was done by a limited number of practitioners. So all the cases, all the excisions, all the pathologies are shuttled through a defined number of practitioners. And what they found is, you have to pardon the x-axis there, I haven't perfected the slide maker yet, is somewhere about 1985 to 1987, there was a profound increase and doubling in the incidence of melanoma. And this really made little or no biologic sense. This corresponded to the education campaign of the population and for awareness of melanoma. And what they found is this particular jump in the incidence of the diagnosis of melanoma, if you, pardon me, this is, if you look at the increase in incidence of melanoma by thickness in the same area, what you'll find is virtually all of the increase in tumors were less than 1.5 millimeters. There was virtually no increase in the incidence of melanoma that could be explained by thick tumors. And if you looked at the excision rates, about the same time, look at the bottom line with the red symbols, you found there was a jump in the excision rates, which corresponded to the increase in the incidence rates, or the diagnosis rate of melanoma. And what they suggested, there were 2 explanations for the jump. The first explanation was that it was lead time bias, or advancement of the time of diagnosis, that you were harvesting cancers and you were getting them earlier in their stage. If this were the case, one would expect a drop in the number of thick lesions at a subsequent time period. And this was not found. And they suggested that it was length time bias, that what was differentially harvested were a series of lesions which had a very indolent or entirely benign disease, benign biologic behavior. And that, in essence, what you were finding were not bad actors. There were similar findings in, if you broke it down into sex. In this case, this is invasive melanoma in Queensland females. In this particular case, the women had a higher incidence of melanoma to start with. And again, virtually all the increase can be explained on the basis of thin lesions as well. And the men, it was even more striking. That with the exception of the small increase that was seen in lesions greater than 3 millimeters, which was localized only to men older the age of 65, virtually all the increase was associated with lesions less than 1.5 millimeters in thickness.
Just a semantic question. You
Yes.
You get the depth of the lesions by invasive, you mean something more than just in situ?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, they didn't deal at all with in situ. In fact, what they found is that it was really a one-to-one correlation. Is that for every thin invasive melanoma, they actually found an equal number of in situs. And those also increased, but they didn't really address that data. Yeah. Now, if indeed you are dealing with a screening-based artifact, that as you increase the surveillance, you increased harvesting the number of cases that are already out there that potentially would have no biologic significance, what would you expect to find? Well, you'd expect to find a large increase in incidence, little or no increase in death. And plus, you'd find little increase in thick lesions as precursors of lesions that might kill patients. You would find the increase incidence most strikingly in those most likely to be medically aware, those who are affluent, those who are educated. Women tend to be more intensive users of medical services, and it was more striking in women. And in individuals with lots of pigmented lesions, although it's been said that individuals with lots of pigmented lesions are at risk for melanoma. Potentially, maybe they're just at risk for the diagnosis of melanoma. And the largest increase would be seen in a population most intensively screened, and that's exactly what we're seeing. Now, is this a phenomenon that's localized just to Australia? Well, it's not. A very interesting example of this is what happened at the Lawrence Livermore Laboratories in California. During the mid-1970s and 1980s, there was a big push at Lawrence Livermore Laboratories for cancer screening. You actually had mole checks on site. And what happened? The incidence of melanoma increased threefold over the general population that could be aged and sex and education and affluence match in the surrounding communities. In particular, if you compare the Lawrence Livermore, NLLL is Lawrence Livermore Laboratory employees, and their dependents both had an increase of melanoma incidence. It was about threefold over, if you want to compare it to Walnut Creek, which was a neighboring HMO. This was done through the Kaiser Permanente group, since most of the people who worked at Lawrence Livermore Laboratories were HMO members. And they compared it to surrounding offices that did not service Lawrence Livermore Laboratory. Walnut Creek being one of them, UC Davis being another, with similar sort of clientele in terms of education and affluence. And if you looked at excision rates, the same story held true, particularly of junctional nevi, that the excision rates of pigmented lesions also were markedly increased over the surrounding populations and really were increased in the same relative proportion as the increase in the incidence of the diagnosis of melanoma. And if you go and look at all these lesions, what you find is all the excess lesions were thin lesions. Again, virtually all of them were less than 0.75 millimeters in thickness, which provides further evidence that this phenomena of increased screening giving increased diagnosis is being observed in all places, virtually all places where their increased screening has come about. The same phenomena has been observed in Europe, in the Netherlands, particularly in Switzerland. In 1988, there was a widespread campaign to increase awareness of melanoma in Switzerland. The incidence of melanoma jumped literally twofold overnight and then reached a new high, a new level plane, suggesting that you get to a population, they become aware, and subsequently the incidence remains elevated. Well, there are parallels to this. In fact, multiple parallels when it comes to cancer screening. One is breast cancer, which I really won't get into here, but breast cancer has had a similar increase in incidence over the past 20 years, and the mortality figures are strikingly level. But perhaps the most striking parallel presently is to prostate cancer. And the prevalence of prostate cancer in older men, which have the histologic appearance of cancer, is extremely high. I mean, the percentages range anywhere from 50 to 80% of men over the age of 60 or 70 or 80. And it appears the more aggressively we look for these cancers, the more we find them. It's sort of, a colleague of mine basically says, you close your eyes, you point and shoot, and you just always hit something. The problem is the biologic behavior of these lesions is completely uncertain. And the relationship between intensity of screening and screening tests in prostate cancer was recently pointed out in an article by Petoskey in JAMA. This was published in January or February of this year. And they examined 4 different SEER areas. These are cancer, basically surveillance areas in the United States, with different uses of the prostate-specific antigen. And what they found is that the diagnosis rate increased with the biopsy rate, which was directly related to the PSA use. And the major question is, what is the value of all this in reducing prostate cancer mortality? And there is no answer to that question at this point. And unless there's controlled trials that are set up in terms of looking at the relationship between intensity of screening and mortality, those answers will never become available. Much of this in melanoma comes back to thin melanomas and certain questions about thin melanomas that perhaps we have the answers to. I don't really think that we do. The first of all, what are the prevalence of these thin lesions? I mean, how many of them are there out there that can be called histologically melanoma? Secondly, what percentage will actually go on to become invasive and aggressive? Do we actually know what the biologic behavior of these lesions and what the natural history of the disease is? And potentially, are we discovering histologic malignancies with little biologic relevance? I mean, one of the advantages we have in dermatology is that we have been able to observe a number of different pseudo-malignancies in the skin, which we realize have benign biologic behavior. Lymphomatoid papulosis. And I've heard many stories about young people with lymphomatoid papulosis who were saved from intensive cancer chemotherapy by their dermatologist or dermatopathologist, who was astute enough to say, wait a second, you don't need to be blasted with Cytoxan. This is a benign disease, even though it looks histologically malignant. Well, if you look at the changes in melanoma thickness over time, you also find a very interesting observation. And there was a study that was undertaken. It was a consortium of dermatopathologists who went back and pulled all their blocks or various blocks from different time periods and then sent them all over the world and reevaluated whether the diagnostic criteria for the diagnosis of melanoma had changed significantly over time. And there were time periods of 1930, 1950, and 1980. And the conclusions of the study is the criteria hadn't changed very much, although there were potentially some flaws in the analysis. That really wasn't the interesting point. The interesting point is to look at what they actually pulled out. And what they found is that in all the lesions they pulled out from 1930, and there were a lot of them, there were hundreds of them, there was no single lesion diagnosed as melanoma that was less than 0.75 millimeters in thickness, and only 4% that were less than 1.5 millimeters in thickness. By 1990, over 50% of all melanomas diagnosed are less than 0.75 millimeters in thickness. And in some limited series, if you look, those lesions less than 0.75 millimeters in thickness are over 70%. We're biopsying different lesions. These are different things that we're taking off of people. And if you want to look at this graphically, you can see the set of bars to the left are less than 1.5 millimeters in thickness. I know I jumped from 0.7, sometimes 0.7, less than 0.75, and sometimes less than 1.5. That has to do with the fact that when you're combining data from different series, some groups looked at less than 0.75, some just looked at less than 1.5. But the lesions less than 1.5, in terms of the percentage of lesions that were diagnosed, has gone from approximately 4 to 5% to almost 80%. From 1930 to 1987, and the lesions that were greater than 3 millimeters has gone from 80% to basically less than 10%. So what we're taking off are different lesions than we used to take off. And why does this get you into trouble? Perhaps the best description of this came from a lay publication, the Atlantic Monthly, which published an article called The Prostate Cancer Dilemma in November of 1993. And the point that was the author was trying to get across was the limitations of the diagnostic techniques that we have now. And in this case, it's the limitations to histopathology. If you think about cancer as a multi-step process, that each step involves some sort of change in the chromatin, some sort of change in the DNA corresponding to some sort of functional step. It is likely that at least maybe 4, 5, 6 steps are required for a tumor cell to develop all the capacities it needs in order to become a malignant tumor. It is also likely that after the acquisition of a few steps, not sufficient enough to give the biologic behavior, that you can develop the histologic appearance of malignancies. And they describe it as, imagine a blindfolded man with an unlimited set of darts. He is standing, let's say, before 6 dartboards. Each time he hits the bullseye, it's the equivalent of a random chromosomal event, which needs to occur prior to malignant change. The exact number of steps required for cancer is unknown, but this is likely to be in the right ballpark. Blindly tossing away, he will hit the equivalent of the bullseye. After hitting 2 or more bullseyes, he will have a histologic cancer. That is, something that looks histologically malignant but doesn't have the biologic potential to kill patients. After a long time, he will hit the actually, I should say after a sufficient time, he will hit the bullseyes of each of the dartboards. And then, therefore, that's the equivalent of a histologic and functional cancer. The ideal diagnostic test will discriminate between 2 hits and 6. And the question is, does histopathology actually do that? I suggest it doesn't. Now, in order to get an idea on that, you have to consider what's actually the prevalence of the thin lesions. If you go back and look at all the different screening data that have been published, there's groups at NYU that have published screening data, groups at Massachusetts have published screening data, groups in the Netherlands. And the striking thing is, in each of those groups, the incidence of thin melanomas always approximates about 0.3%, 1 in 250 to 1 in 350. And if you just take a ridiculous estimate based, well, if 1 in 250 to 1 in 350 people in the population have these lesions, you're talking about a prevalence in the U.S. population of up to 500,000 to 1 million thin melanomas in the general population that exist right here, right now. And in fact, you can come up with that number a second way, using very plausible estimates. For example, if you assume that most melanomas are diagnosed through self-examination, and virtually, let's say, only 10% of the U.S. population routinely examine themselves on an ongoing basis looking for melanoma, which is 1 in 10 people, I'd say that's probably a fairly reasonable estimate. And if it's similar to what it's seen in Australia, that only 1 in 3 of those individuals actually goes to the physician if they find a worrisome lesion. If you multiply it out, you're assuming then that the 30,000 melanomas diagnosed annually in the population are diagnosed in less than 5% of the population. So if you multiply, if you assume that the incidence of the thin lesions are the same in the remaining 95% of the population, you come up with 500,000 to 1 million thin melanomas in the population at large right now. Well, where are all the thick lesions that should develop from all these precursors? You can, in fact, you can play with numbers, which is something I like to do. If you take an overall melanoma diagnosis rate that's typical of Australia in 1980, which is 20 per 100,000, you can assume that the thick lesion rate, which was 6 per 100,000 at that time, is reflective of the incidence of prior lesions which have gone undiagnosed. And assuming 100% progression rate, which probably is not true, and a constant actual incidence, this means that 33% of earlier melanomas escaped early detection. It suggests that 33% of the population is not being adequately screened, and the early diagnosis is being done in the remaining 67% of the population. Now, that's really the best case scenario in terms of interpretation of the data, suggesting that we actually are making an impact. Well, let's say the melanoma incidence goes to 60 per 100,000, which it has. You'd expect that the thick lesion rate should approach 33% of 60 per 100,000 or 20 per 100,000. Hasn't happened. Hasn't even come close to happening. So what are the possible explanations? Better surveillance of the population. There's no evidence whatsoever that we're able to deliver better surveillance of the population. And in fact, the 67% surveillance rate is really extremely unlikely. Well, potentially a lower progression rate or no true increase in incidence. Both of those may in fact be true. And you actually can vary all these variables any way you want. You can assume the thick lesion rate equals the previous percent of the population that's undiagnosed times the total melanoma rate times the progression rate. So you can assume a 50% progression rate. Well, that means that if you're seeing 6 per 100,000 as a thick lesion rate, it means that had a result from an undiagnosed thin rate, which was actually twice as high as that, 12 per 100,000. And that would suggest, doing the calculations, that in fact you're missing 50% of the population. If the progression rate drops to 10%, and given the rest of the numbers, in fact, it means it looks like you're missing 70% of the population in terms of screening. And if you have only a 1% progression rate, it means you're getting all your melanomas from 3% of the population. That the percent that you actually miss is 97%, and the undiagnosis rate of thin lesions approaches 600 per 100,000. Well, remember, the surveys in Australia suggest at most that they're able to get to 15 to 20% of the population. And I'd say that's a liberal estimate. Well, given all this as a background, does early detection save lives? And does aggressive screening of the general population actually result in early detection of clinically relevant lesions? Well, this answer really isn't no. There's no real data to suggest this. But it raises issues about screening in general. And have we sat back and thought about screening? I mean, medical screening has become familiar to many in our country and throughout the world. The premise is simple. You catch the condition early before symptoms arise, and it's easily treated. I guess the concept is simple, but in fact, it's not so simple. And there are potential problems. There are real problems. Conceptual basis of screening. The disease is highly prevalent. It causes considerable morbidity and mortality. I think melanoma falls into this category. It causes thousands of deaths each year. Premise number two, the natural history of the disease is known. I dare say that the natural history, particularly of these thin lesions, is not known, and that is a real problem. Early treatment can prevent morbidity and mortality. Potentially true. I mean, clearly, if you're able to identify the one that's going to kill somebody and take it off, you can help someone. The question is, how many other lesions are you going to have to remove before you find a real one? And then a safe, inexpensive, and I should say a sensitive, safe, and specific inexpensive screening test exists. Well, that's another problem. It actually doesn't appear to exist. What is the melanoma screen? The screen is the physical exam, the ABCDE criteria. Question, is it sensitive and specific? What is the definitive test? Because if you have a screening test, you got to be able to turn around and say, okay, of the ones I think I'm worried about, what percentage are the real McCoy? And you have to have a test that is the gold standard, that when you do the test, you actually get the results you get reflect what you think you have. Is this sensitive and specific? Maybe not. And what is the treatment? Well, that fortunately for dermatology is the good part, is that it's not like we have to open people up and take out major organs, and there's significant morbidity for each individual procedure. We have a relatively safe and effective treatment for this. Now, when you look at screening tests, you look at issues of sensitivity and specificity. And then you can calculate various things. Positive predictive value, that is, what percent of the true positives are really true positives, and what percent of the negatives are true negatives. Well, when it comes to dermatology, the dermatologic screen for the melanoma, we're down at positive predictive values. Well, no one really knows. The question is, how many benign lesions do you have to take off to get a malignant one? They could be as high as 20%, could be as low as 1%. It's hard to know, because it's hard to know how many lesions are actually taken off for rule-out melanoma. And remember, our imperative and the pressures that we are under as physicians are to push our sensitivity to 100%. You don't want to ever miss a lesion, because you get sued for that, and it's, criticism is terrible. Remember, as you push any set test where the sensitivity goes to 100%, the incremental going from 95 to 100% takes an incredible effort, and your specificity generally falls tremendously, because you have to harvest increasingly more and more banal clinical lesions in order to increase your sensitivity to 100%. So the sources of uncertainty are the screening test, which results in large numbers of false positives. And then, getting back to the definitive test, the biopsy, the more and more thin lesions that are sent to the histopathologists, and plus given the same imperative not to ever miss a melanoma, to push the sensitivity to 100%, results in a problem, because the technology, conventional histopathology, is incapable of yielding useful information about the biologic behavior of the lesions. And I think the statistics really point to that. that the huge number in increase in thin lesions that are being diagnosed, and really the statistics don't point to aggressive biologic behavior. With screening, who are we screening? Who are we missing? What percentage of the population at risk is actually being examined? Who is diagnosed? And who is dying of melanoma? Well, starting with the last question, who's being diagnosed is the affluent, the educated, the medically aware. Who's dying of melanoma? Basically, it's a group that can be described by three characteristics: male, poor, and uneducated. But that's not where the screening efforts are being pushed at this point. What population is being at risk? What population at risk are now being examined? Basically, again, it's the educated and the affluent. And in fact, if you look at the apparent risk factors of the diagnosis of melanoma, they're equivalent to the same risk factors for biopsy. There's a story about sun sensitivity and history of blistering sunburn. Of course, if you ask anybody who's pale-skinned, who's grown up in a sunny climate, whether they got a blistering sunburn as a child, it approaches 100% as far as I can tell. If you have lots of pigmented lesions, you end up going, and you're educated, you end up going to the doctor. And if you go to the doctor enough with nevi and express anxiety about them, they're going to get biopsied. And the more you biopsy them, the more you're going to find something. And those, in fact, are the risk factors, same risk factors for biopsy. If someone comes to my office and they're anxious and they have pigmented lesions, I biopsy. I mean, I'm scared to death I'm going to miss something. The more we educate the public to be anxious about these things, the more we're going to end up doing this. Well, what's the implications of overdiagnosis? Well, cost, the financial and emotional costs. These are not limited to those who are screened, though. And in fact, this is a real important point. It's felt the moment you make a diagnosis of melanoma in an individual, it's immediately felt by all first-degree relatives. Because then the first thing you tell them is, you have to get all your first-degree relatives in here for us to examine. So it's geometric, and that particular impact will tend to amplify and magnify, because the more you examine the first-degree relatives and the more you tend to biopsy the relatives, I suggest that the more you're going to, higher chance that you're going to find these thin precursor lesions, which likely have an incredibly high incidence of incidence in the population that we don't realize. The number of pigmented lesions which may need to be removed is absolutely mind-boggling. Just take a simple assumption. Let's say there are 1 million lesions out there. And in order to really make and let's also make the assumption that the real melanomas develop from those. So in order to make a 50% decrease in the number of thick lesions and mortality that arises at a later time, you have to remove half of those. So 500,000 lesions. And let's say you have to remove 100 benign lesions for every malignant one you get. Maybe you have to remove more. You're talking about removing 50 to 100 million moles. And it's an ongoing thing, because it's likely that the kinetics are if people move into that, and more lesions will appear as patients get older. So the rate of mole removal is just astounding. Potential costs, people always talk about aggregate costs. Well, physicians' fees, path fees, time lost from work may run into billions of dollars. But I like to think in more individual terms, because ultimately when it comes down to it, individual patients make decisions to have moles taken off. And is it worth it? Well, I mean, these decisions can only be made by individual patients making decisions based upon the best reliable information supplied by their physicians. And if we're not informing them regarding the uncertainty that actually exists within this field, we're not giving them good information. And this has implications regarding the integrity of dermatology. You know, is aggressive screening for melanoma in the best interest of our patients, or is it in the best interest of dermatologists? And there's no question in my mind that widespread pigmented lesion screening will likely benefit dermatologists greatly. Unless our actions are based upon sound and justifiable principles, we're likely to ultimately be perceived as promoting fear in order to enhance our financial standing. This can turn around and bite us in a few years. So in summary, the large increase in melanoma diagnosis throughout the world has been accompanied by a perplexing lack of increase in mortality. Virtually all of the increase in incidence can be accounted for by an increase in the diagnosis of thin lesions. And it is virtually impossible to reconcile the explosive increase in incidence with a lack of any change in mortality. One possible explanation for these findings is the apparent increase represents harvesting from a large pool of precursor lesions of uncertain biologic behavior. And because the natural history of early lesions diagnosed as melanoma is uncertain, the widespread institution of screening of the population needs to be done only after control trials which address changes in melanoma mortality. Thank you very much.
Very much. I think it was everything at least I thought was going to be living up to. Questions, Mandy?
Well, first of all, I appreciate your presentation, and I wish we had you back again in this fall, because we're going to do our O'Leary meeting, which is one of the meetings we put on here on melanoma. And we're going to have several people speaking about melanoma, including some people who talk about the incidence, and Daryl Regal is going to come, and everybody who's heard him talk, certainly he's a good speaker and can tell us very clearly how the incidence is increasing, and it's increasing rapidly. And I think you're right, it is a double-edged sword. I've often, certainly a significant portion of my practice and Dave's practice is taking off melanomas that are thin, but I've often wondered, just as you wondered, what's the natural progression of this? For example, we know that people with dysplastic nevus syndrome or atypical mole syndrome, whichever the terminology is today, they're generally not born with dysplastic nevi. They generally acquire them. They may have a genetic predisposition, but they generally acquire them over a lifetime. And we also know that they actually regress once they get older. And the question occurs to me is that, well, gee, we remove some of these lesions that we call melanomas. Really, would they have regressed, or had they not progressed, just as you suggested? I remember speaking with Bob Boltz, who was the chair of the department that I trained in, and he would tell me that years past, the pathologists, he made the comment about thin lesions not in the 1930s population. Well, it may be that they simply didn't remove, it's not so much that they didn't remove those lesions, maybe not so much that they made the diagnosis. It was typical, he says, in those days, that you didn't make a diagnosis of a melanoma at that thin a stage, because melanoma was such a death knell for those people that the insurance companies wouldn't cover them. So the pathologists just didn't make that diagnosis. It wasn't a practical thing.
Although when they went back and reviewed over those slides, they just simply didn't find them. They just simply didn't find them.
But I would say that you bring up some very important points, because clearly this, in some ways, you need a study that you couldn't do today. In other words, since the Tuskegee studies of the 1930s and 40s and so on, where you would have two populations, one that was treated and one that wasn't, if you tried to generate a population of melanomas that would be untreated and watch their lifetime progression.
No, I think you could, but it's the difference between you can intensively screen a population and not intensively screen a population. And I would say there's no change in how I manage patients on a daily basis. Somebody comes to me with a pigmented lesion and I get worried about it, I take it off. There's no question. It doesn't, fully realizing that I might be taking off something that's never going to bother them. But there's a difference between doing that and then intensively going out and promoting patients to come in for widespread melanoma screening and sort of generating anxiety and hysteria about it in the entire population. And I think it's a mistake to do that at this point in time, because of the fact is that we simply don't know what we're going to end up with. I think we're going to end up with just huge numbers of precursor lesions.
And
yes?
actually, the screening tests, maybe melanoma may be a little bit too blatant of an example, but they're ongoing now. University of Minnesota has a controlled group of patients that they're doing yearly mammograms, ovarian ultrasound, chest x-ray, and something else, colon x-rays, in a control group, but they're not. They're just having intervention as symptoms arise. So increasingly, these kinds of studies are...
The real question of whether or not there's actually going to be a difference in mortality at the end of those studies.
Well, what I meant wasn't so much that the screening, I mean, that you can measure, but what I'm saying is if your question is what's the natural biological progression of a thin melanoma. In other words, if you made a diagnosis of a thin melanoma, and would you not treat it to find out what its natural
Well, but although technically, theoretically, just from looking at the numbers you can make ballpark estimates of percent of progression. Just looking at the diagnosis rate and comparing it to the mortality rate and back calculating what percentage of the population is screened, you could make some reasonable assumptions about the progression rate. And it's not very high. It's not
The
very
problem
high.
then, of course, is that you don't treat populations, you treat people.
True, no, but you don't treat, you screen populations. You can treat people and not screen populations.
There have been interesting cases. I remember that a few years ago in the archives, Tom Fitzpatrick's experience with Lennox malignant, that in fact they knew that population existed because of fairly good clinical indication, photographs and everything else, and literally let them go because they weren't. Nothing more was done.
But in fact, that's the population where they die from
right.
it, in fact.
But in fact, some of those, in fact, live
Yeah.
15, 20 years, so there is a very long lifetime for some of them. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad this is a topic that's great. I mean, it's something that we all need to wrestle with for the coming years. I'm glad to see we have 58 minutes left in the hour
Yeah.
to do that.
Really spoke
Somebody
quickly.
makes
Yeah, that was amazing.
Yeah.
So, but I have a couple of comments. One is that I agree with the general assumption that because of our increased awareness, that there is an increase in the incidence because of finer diagnostic mechanisms. But unlike what some of your conclusion or concluding remarks indicated, it's not that there is no increase in mortality. There is an increase in mortality. In fact, from the 1960s, the rate of increase in in mortality is in fact increasing. And if you look at that specifically, it's alarming that it's the rate of increase is increasing.
Based which data are you talking about?
Well, the graph you showed early in your talk,
Yeah.
comparing incidence and mortality. Certainly, incidence causes mortality to pale, and I agree that there's a vast number of those.
But the actual increase in mortality is in a very defined subgroup. Virtually all of the increase. There's absolutely no increase in mortality of women. Zero. In fact, the mortality statistics, even though the incidence has gone up dramatically in women, there's no increase in women. And in men, all of the increase in mortality is confined to men over 65. So it's, and the, yeah.
I agree. If our screening is increasing at such a great rate and we're diagnosing them earlier, then I would submit that if there is no increase in incidence of the serous melanoma that we're all worried about, then mortality should either be flat or logically even decrease. Now, there's an issue of age, where the population is living longer. But that's a reality. We have to deal with that. And I think that what we do know about the natural history of melanoma is that the early lesions, thank goodness, may have a 15 or 20 year lag period. Well, if you look at the old studies of mortality in melanoma, or incidence in melanoma, that came to medical attention, the ages were in the 50s. Well, more recently, now you get these population-based reviews, the age is creeping up. Now it's 61, now 59, 61, increase from 53 to 54. What that means is that these people who are dying are just surviving long enough for that benign, superficial, biologically benign melanoma to finally become a significant problem. And I think that assuming that people are going to live longer, I think that there will be a continued increase in the older population. And so I guess if I had to make one comment about any kind of any kind of plea to avoid hysteria, and I don't think we're really engendering hysteria. I think they may be hysterical in the wealthy population or the educated population. But what we need to do is push our screening into other populations and try to continue to educate so hysteria doesn't take over. But I think that making points that that dermatologists may be, off the mark here, would be counterproductive in the long run, because in fact, I think that there is going to be if there isn't a real incidence and a real increased incidence in mortality from melanoma, there will be as our population gets older and survives long enough to have their superficial spreading melanomas become nodular and metastasize.
I mean, your points are well taken. I think that we need to temper that with recognition that the technology we use to diagnose the disease is completely inadequate. And given that, plus the fact that the imperative from society is to push the sensitivity to 100%. I don't know if you went to the controversies of pigmented lesions at the Academy, a huge room filled with literally thousands of people. And virtually every person who got up there went up and showed the most banal of pigmented lesions, followed by the histology saying this was a melanoma. So what that happens then is that the practitioners who aren't in practice get incredibly anxious, and they realize that their clinical skills are not capable of determining what is going to be histologically called benign versus what is histologically going to be called malignant.
Or more importantly, what is biologically malignant?
They're divorcing those. They're divorced from that. And the problem that we're now sending is the message that we're sending is that this histology, if you have a patient who has a lesion that looks this banal and has this histology, that if you don't take that lesion off, that patient's going to die. And the fact is, that's likely not to be the case. We need to reevaluate how we as dermatologists view the biologic behavior of these lesions and how aggressively we remove pigmented lesions. Because the push is to take off the most banal, clinically banal lesions.
You have to take, it is true that this kind of public education can appear self-serving. Clearly, by doing the screening, by publicizing the Skin Cancer Day, the Melanoma Monday, clearly is a public relations effort, and you can argue the benefits of that. But you also have to recognize, as I'm sure we all do, that this is not happening as an isolated event. It's happening in a society where over the past 10 or 15 years, medical information and the thirst that Americans have for medical information has also exponentially increased. And there are many many spins off on that, and that's the nature with which we live.
I agree with you, but it's the perceptions that are important. Whether or not people in this room or people in the community are very enthusiastic about melanoma because they think that it'll make them a lot of money, and I assume that that's really a tiny percentage of individuals. That doesn't make any difference. If the public ultimately ends up, their perception is that we're doing it for financial reasons, we're in trouble. And our role is to provide information. And when there is uncertainty regarding that information, we better convey it to the public. And that's not being conveyed now. The message is, you better get these things off or you're going to die. Melanoma, death. Melanoma, death. And the fact is, we need to temper these particular comments to the public. We need to say, well, it may be that these spots are not, when they're this small, a lot of them may not go on to develop melanoma. We think if you're worried about a spot, it should come off. We need to scale back our criteria clinically of whether or not we're going to take off spots, and tell the public right up front, if you want us to take off every spot to guarantee that you're going to never have a melanoma, we're going to have to remove every pigmented lesion on your body. And personally, I don't view that's a good idea, but that's the only way to avoid ever missing one. And that, in fact, is the thing that we're being pushed for. You never want to miss one.
Well, it seems to me you could apply this reasoning to any number of diseases.
It's true.
I mean, the criteria in the 30s were different for any number of diseases, and you're going to find different statistics. The ability to diagnose, I think, has become better. Histopathology has become better. And I think the public appreciates the fact that we're willing to participate and try to diagnose these lesions early. Now, whether we're over-diagnosing or trolling for moles, I don't know. But, of course, many of these patients belong to HMOs or managed care groups, and there's no financial incentive in that group to take off more moles. So I think, in general, the public wants early detection. They want it in breast cancer. They want it in other cancer-type lesions. So I think that you're...
But it doesn't work.
Well, no, I'm not sure that, I don't agree with that. I think there are many lesions that have been picked up early, and even if it's not, there's not that many people getting mortality, even if you prevent a small percentage, I think that's what you should be doing.
But given the data in Australia, it would suggest that the actual incidence of these thin lesions is so high that the number of lesions you'd actually have to remove in order to make an actual impact on mortality is 2 orders of magnitude higher than we're removing now. So everyone would have to remove 100-fold higher number of lesions than you're removing right now in order to make any sort of impact, because the numbers are so huge.
And
Well,
also,
yeah.
the screens, though, there's always a bias screen. The people you're screening are going to be the people who are concerned about it. The 1 in 250 or 1 in 350 is bound to be, if not twice as high an incidence, maybe even greater. I wonder if those studies address that.
Well,
But-
they didn't really address it. The striking thing is the number is constant wherever the screen is done.
I think there's a bias because for screening, because it's only going to be the well-educated and the persons who might have a black mole that they say, oh my God, maybe.
Well, you
there's
could
a
make the
freak
point that, in
screen.
fact, that the screen population, since they potentially have less sun exposure and less exposure to carcinogens, would be lower, and then the actual incidence in the general population could be 2-fold higher. Intriguingly, there's an article that was just published in the Archives of Dermatology this past month that looked at screening in the Netherlands in 2 separate years, 1990 and 1993. And in 1990, they had an aggressive campaign for all skin cancers. And in 1993, they tried to focus the public education effort on melanoma. They got more melanomas, but what happened is the percent of lesions of the population who had melanomas was absolutely identical, 0.3%. So it may be that there is, no matter how you address the screen, that you're going to get the same percentage of lesions. It's hard to ignore the fact that the evidence suggests that you are not adequately getting to the overwhelming percentage of the population, 80, 90, maybe 95% of the population, you're not touching at all. And that virtually all the melanomas that you're diagnosing are in a small subgroup. Why aren't you seeing thicker lesions appearing in the remaining 80%? I mean, it just doesn't make sense.
No, I'm going to say that I think that you've made some, don't feel like we're attacking.
Yeah, no. I think it's your role to do that, in fact.
Clearly, you make some points that there's no question that there's validity, and as I said before, the management of melanoma, unfortunately, is not a macro management. You don't manage it by the population, you manage it by the person. And there's always the individual case. And for example, when Nancy Reagan had her mastectomy for the small breast cancer some years ago, it was felt to be because it was so widely publicized, it was felt to be a drawback to the attempt that surgeons were going to smaller excisions. And everybody who's had a patient with melanoma that did not do well, as the patient you remember, you don't remember the 50 that did great. And especially the young person who died in 6 months or whatever is always the one you think of. And it's unfortunate, but it's true, and that's the nature of medicine, that you use your best judgment on an individual patient, and not just based on population studies. The patient doesn't care what the incidence is and what the cure rate is. They care about what the incidence and cure rate is for them, for one person, and that's the problem.
Could I just have you give a closing comment about epiluminescent microscopy?
Again, when you apply a technique that increases your sensitivity, your specificity potentially goes to hell as well. And it's like any test you have in medicine. There's an inverse relationship between sensitivity and specificity. All our efforts have been pushed toward increasing our sensitivity. And because of it, the specificity, I think our specificity of diagnosis is dropping. And it's just a matter of it becomes a more philosophical argument. How many benign lesions do you think that it's worthwhile to take off in order to take off a malignant one? 10? Sure. 100? Maybe. 1,000? 10,000? And no one knows really the answer to that question because we simply don't know what the denominator is.
Well, actually, it goes beyond that. We don't really know what malignancy is.
Right.
That's-
Well, we know what it is when we see it. You know, if there's somebody who's dead or dying, we know that that's what malignancy is. But the problem is we don't know what early malignancy is. Yes.
Well, thanks very
Thank
much.
you. Excuse me.
Wait till I think.